Hello, and welcome to a new edition of the Mahoning Movement Show. Hey, Joe.
Good. How's your Thanksgiving, bud?
Happy Thanksgiving. How'd it go for you?
Real good.
Good.
I had a nice time on the beach and stuff like that.
You went to the beach?
Yeah, I went to Nags Head down North Carolina for
nice.
Thanksgiving.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Pretty neat.
Yeah, Atlantic Ocean. It's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Water was way too cold to do anything in.
Oh, yeah, I bet. Yeah. And mine was good as well.
Good.
Yeah.
Good to hear. Did you do anything fun?
Same old family stuff. And then we had a high school reunion for Ursuline, my class of 2000. So, yeah, it was pretty good overall. Howdy.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Good times. So we're here on the Mahoning Movement Show. I thought I'd bring it back to square one where we're at, because we've gone some tangents past couple weeks, but hopefully we can tie it all back together. All right. So the whole gist of this show is we're doing this project. It's my master's project for YSU, is advocating to connect the Sewage Trail to the Ravenna bike trail, and that would connect our entire region, and that coincides with the original Pennsylvania and Ohio Canal, which originally really tied our region to the greater nation. But we got off on a little tangent because of all the YSU stuff, and the butchering of academics at YSU right now, and how students are leading the protest movement to try to save academics. And it's been real kind of disappointing the community leaders around who haven't said too much about it, but the students have done a really great job in protesting to save the academics at YSU as well as the faculty. But we started talking about that on the show, but it is relevant to this whole bike trail project. Number one, it's because I'm doing this project through the American Studies Department at YSU, which is being canceled. But that's not too bad because applied history will still continue, and hopefully it will. So at least people could still do the kind of education I'm getting there right now. You can still get at YSU after American Studies is sunsetted. But the really bad thing is them canceling the MFA program, the Masters of Fine Literature, as well as what they're doing to Dr. Jacob Leben's canceling his contract. But so we got into a little bit of philosophical discussion about the nature of education, and that's relevant to this project as well, because the idea is not just build the bike trail, but also talk about our history along the way. And it's a great, it's one of those fancy words, but I think it's really apt and heuristic. Was it HEURISTIC, heuristic? And that's the idea of like how you learn, the method in which you learn, and one of which is like a self-discovery thing. And that's what I find is like the greatest aspect of bike trails, aside from being outside nature, moving along somewhere. It's learning the history along the way. And so that's what the idea behind this project is that we not only build this bike trail, not just bike trail, but all active transportation trail, but also talk about the history along the way. So we got into discussions about the nature of education. And I was thinking about that on the way over about what we'd talk about. And so we kind of have, in talking about our philosophical perspectives, but we're also practical people as well. Right. But we are, and one extreme to phrase it is like you're a libertarian and I'm an anarcho-Marxist. But of course, we're pragmatic people that we live in a society along the way, and we come to agreement about how you do this. So we've talked about, what is the nature of education? What's the role of government or collective societal action on that? And as you know, I feel strongly about higher education being included. That is like something that our society needs to collectively do through the agency of government to ensure that we have a proper education system all the way from womb to tomb. But especially we need more pre-K. And then, of course, kindergarten through high school, that's a given. That's accepted in society. But also higher education, seeing that as more of a right than just a privilege. So we talked about that. And so I wanted to like bring forth a notion I've been thinking about more that I haven't heard too much about, but I'm kind of like working out in my mind, and that is the right to transportation. So to me, like the core right that I think, and we could have a whole another discussion about that, but the right to healthcare. I think healthcare should be a universal human right, which it's not in America. And there's people who die in this country for not being able to afford the proper health care. Why is insulin so much more in this country than it is in Canada and things like that? But that's a whole other discussion. But talking about transportation as a right, and I don't think that, I'm not implying that the government should write all expense paid, cruise ship tours for everybody. Although in a lot of the Icelandic countries where the northeastern Europe, there is like a lot of paid vacation time and whatnot. But just the idea of transportation, having accessibility of transportation as a human right. And I'm really happy with our WRTA system in this area, and it's really cool that they went to free rides. But the problem with our country, I think overall, is so much has been putting the automobile first more than anything. And you could call it the whole chicken and egg thing about, are we so dependent on cars in this country? Um, it, it's not just that that is like the easiest way to do things. It was planned that way. And that we let the fossil fuel industry and the automobile industry kind of dictate public policy at the expense of a lot of our neighborhoods as well. And if you look at like where the freeway system were often built at, a lot of times they would cut right through black neighborhoods, and same thing in Youngstown up you have the Madison Avenue Expressway there. That was a thriving black business district, and they built a freeway through it. So in talking about this whole transportation project and connecting active transportation trails, seeing that not just as a nice thing to do, like we said in the first episode about like it's not just recreation of that it's nice to be outside, but actually considering it a part of our transportation infrastructure and people utilizing it to go to work and do whatever else they need to do. And we also brought up on a previous show the example of Amazon when it was looking for a city to build a new hub, and they were looking at Dallas, but they didn't end up going with Dallas because Dallas didn't have enough of a green hike and bike infrastructure for them. So I don't know where we want to take it from there.
Well,
But so in thinking about how we look at rights, and so the way I understand from we both believe in rights of individuals. From a
Yes.
libertarian perspective, I find it's often that it is a right in terms of a freedom from government.
Yes.
That really being concerned with government overreach, which my anarchist side also aligns with. I am also very distrustful of government and worry about government as a power structure. Now, the ideal of government to me is collective societal action, and that is good. I believe that should be 100% democracy, 100% democracy. But government as it truly exists everywhere in the world pretty much is that it's its own power source with its own hierarchy, and it's not true democracy. So I share the libertarian and probably your concerns about government overreach, but also the kind of like more socialist side of things kind of sees government as being able to provide the fulfillment of those rights. So if healthcare is a human right, then we use government as the tool to fulfill that human right, which I agree with. But like I said, I'm also very distrustful of government as well. So how do you resolve that? And I'm asking, myself as well, like trying to think about what is a pragmatic solution to do what we need to do as a society for the good of us individually and as a collective. How do you fulfill those rights in a way that ensures that you don't have government overreach and whatnot, government as a power structure as an overreach? How do you fulfill those rights and taking an active societal role in fulfilling those rights? So if we say healthcare is a human right, that we collectively figure out society, how do you fulfill that every person has healthcare? And that education, the same thing. How do we collectively make sure that people have access to proper education? And then thirdly, talking about this whole transportation thing, how do we take an active role to ensure, first of all, what does that even mean about a right to transportation? And second of all, how do we fulfill that? And I think this country, obviously, if you look at the budget of things, how much we spend on automobile infrastructure. And I saw there was some other statistic about like all of Amtrak's for its 50-year history, all of the governmental funding that goes towards that doesn't equal 1 year of highway funding. So like we have a very heavy, and look at how this country, look at how United States, we continue to subsidize fossil fuel industry. They're a multi-billion industry, and also the number one contributor to climate change. And they knew about it. Exxon knew about it back in the 50s. And just like the tobacco and sugar industry, they sought to cover up the data, even though they knew it was a real thing. So this country has given automobile and fossil fuel companies precedence at what I would argue is to the detriment of the rest of society and to the detriment of our society. And I think part of all this and envisioning, what does it mean to have a right to transportation, and needing more hike and bike trails and other forms of transportation, that we need to kind of balance that back out for our past 50 plus years of automobile and fossil fuel industry coming first.
Okay, so here's where we start. Well, you and I are both sort of like coming to the story late, where there's so much stuff that's entrenched that you can't get rid of. It's we're stuck with it, and we're two practical guys, so we're starting in the middle of a story, and we're thinking, okay, well, we're gonna problem solve our way out of this, but we got to deal with what's in front of us. We can't tear it down. We just can't carpet bomb and start from scratch. We got to pick up, even if we don't agree with where things are at. We got to kind of try to make the best use of people and infrastructure and whatever that we already have.
Mhm.
Now, you and I would like to solve the same kinds of problems.
Mhm.
The only difference is that the utility of using government to solve those things, I've considered them the same big corrupt industry like ag and pharma and whatever, and I'm reluctant to give them any kind of power to be wielded to solve any of these problems. I just don't trust that they're able to do it.
Mhm.
Now, from a libertarian standpoint, I want to solve a problem, and I don't want to give you power, right, that you just get to keep forever. What I want to do is I want to grant you and say, okay, we're going to solve healthcare. Right? I don't
Mhm.
think you can do it. You think that you can. You have to market to me. We have to be able to break up regularly to see if I keep want you to solve this problem. If you can't solve it, I want to move on to the next guy until it actually gets solved.
Mhm.
But if I like trench out a safe space for you to operate where nobody can compete against you and nobody could take your tools away from you, we're stuck with you whether or not you can do a good job or not. So I want to say, okay, let's solve the healthcare problem.
Mhm.
Let's take everything that's these great deals for that industry, rip them away. Let's make it so that it is a free market, right? There's going to be some downside to that, but at the same time, let's pick somebody who wants to solve the part of the problem that nobody's been able to, give them a 1-year deal, go, and we'll look at it at the end of the year. If they're making progress, we'll give you another year. If not, we're going to pick somebody else.
In a way, the vaccine thing kind of used that approach, didn't it? That of the government funding, how it went to the ramping up the vaccine.
Isn't that weird? Under those circumstances, it happens in a year, and any other time, it's 20 years
Mhm.
of protecting certain companies. And
Well, let me ask you this on this whole tangent.
Yeah.
Should the vaccine companies, Pfizer, Moderna, should they make it public domain, the vaccine, so that now, especially with the whole Omicron variant coming around, that there is some call, I think Biden called for opening it up to allow for generic manufacture, whatever. Should those private industries, should they open
Well,
up, or should they be forced
do you
to be
know
open up?
much about that? Do you know much of the details?
Not too
So
much.
my big thing is like when they negotiated and had these companies created, what kind of deal did we get on the production? I mean, are we paying like a premium on the production, or did we actually negotiate it till it was somewhat reasonable? Like, what did we have to do to
Did
get
we
them to do it?
negotiate the price per dose and stuff like
Yeah,
that?
right.
That is a good question. I
Because
don't
that's a
know.
free ride. They don't have to
Mhm.
compete against other companies. It was a blank check to produce whatever we
It was,
needed.
yeah.
Are we paying $100 a pill for this thing? Are we paying $10? Like I'm, you know
Well,
what I
yeah,
mean?
well, and going back to the whole insulin thing too, like, and there's something like Bernie Sanders brings up a lot, like why in America is something like, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's like hundreds of dollars for insulin for Americans, but it's $12 in Canada, and
Right.
and I think that's not just what people pay. I think Canadians get for free regardless with their socialized healthcare, but that's what the actual cost is. So the Canadian government pays something like $12 a dose for insulin, whereas the American, whether it's the insurance company or the government through Medicaid or someone who's paying out of pocket, it's something like hundreds. I don't know. I think it's like 300 some dollars. So yeah, what is that with the vaccine as well? Did we get a deal? Did the United States government, by helping fund and ramp up production or research, did we get a deal or not? And I think that's the really concerning thing with our government, is that we let the lobbyists determine it, not what's good for the people, but that we let the lobbyists, and you get these healthcare lobbyists to say, sure, give us millions of dollars in research and development money, but then there's nothing on the back end. Yeah, it's good that we have a vaccine now, but where's the back end of that? We should get a deal, as we talked about this
But
before.
it
It
could
should
be
be an investment.
transparent. It could be like we went to the manufacturers and they're going to lose money and they're going to take their targets off other products that they could be developing to make this vaccine. So we'll give them like a year to be able to claw back whatever losses that they make. And this could be like they know what are going to lose by making it. We know what we're going to offer them, and we know how long we're going to make it so that before it's open or private to open domain. So.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I wish we had an expert here that
That's
knew
right.
exactly.
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, it is. Yeah, not like to know, but
But in
that's
an emergency, like if your house is on fire, you're not looking at the cost of putting it out, right? You want the house to
you
not
just
be
got to
on
get
fire. But
done.
there's going to be a certain point where you're like, was the ambulance ride $100,000, and then after the fact, you're like, oh, that like is going to destroy us financially.
Hmm. But yeah, that's talking about like profits in general in the healthcare industry. I think it's morally wrong to be motivated by profits in that industry. That healthcare needs to be its own. Like I said, it's a right. And we as a society need to figure out for our collective good as well, not just as like um, like some I don't know right wing person would say, "Oh, this person doesn't want to work or anything. Why should we give them healthcare?" But with as we learn from this pandemic, collective health does affect everyone, and I would argue the same thing about education as well. That if you allow this person to not have an education, it's going to affect you in the society you live in one way or the other.
Right.
And same thing with healthcare. So how do we ensure that we're all taken care of and not just have a but when you have profits, when you have a company that's solely focused on profits, and that can mean to the detriment of human health, then that's morally wrong. I mean, look at who was Pharma Bro or whatever that jacked up the AIDS medication price and everything. That kid's a punk,
Right.
but he got it. I think did he go to prison for
He
something?
did.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good at least. And he got that Wu-Tang album too, which I would like to hear it.
But I'm telling you that I don't necessarily think that you just have to have one option. You can have a set of medicine. Like I want there to be in every industry, there'd be superstars. I want guys to be able to dunk. I want us to have the best specialists in the world. I want us to be sought after.
Mhm.
And if you take the profit incentive, you create everybody's a public defendant and nobody's the superstar attorney because of that reason. But I think both of them can exist. I don't necessarily think you need to go all profit mode of medicine, right?
Mhm.
Can have part of it that's state that brings everybody to labor. So let's just say public schools, right, was the hit all the standards school.
Mhm.
And then you had private schools that if you wanted to pay for rock star treatment, then you can get rock star treatment and everything in between.
Sure. Well, I have mixed feelings about that too, because I truly believe that. Well, I went to Catholic school, and I'm glad I'm happy I went to Ursuline, and I like to go into St. Brennan's overall, pretty much. Um, but I believe that, and I think it was a better experience and possibly better education than I would have gotten in public school. But I believe it should be no one should have access to better education than anyone else. So how like simultaneously, I like Ursuline culture as like an institution, sing the fight song, whatever. But at the same time, no one should have a leg up on anyone else, and we need to make sure our public schools are just as robust as the Catholic school network. But I still believe in the choice that you should be able to have your own school system. I don't know. It's
Well,
a question.
I think the reason we're complaining about it is because all of the systems we're talking about are just broken and they feel like they're irreparably, like nobody can actually fix it. So if public education was an easy fix, I'm sure somebody would have done it because it's a noble pursuit, right?
Yeah, but it took people doing it. It wasn't like some kind of government mandate, and that was one of the things that came out of Reconstruction in the South after the Civil War. That a lot of public school system was actually created by Black residents in the South during Reconstruction of forming a public school system. So yeah, it's one of those things that was fought for, a right that was kind of fought for and not just granted. Um, and yeah, maybe we kind of need to get back to those roots more in some ways.
Now, if I told you, like the part of the healthy part of the libertarian thing is that you got to build a breakup into everything that you do. So if you were to say scrap the public education system and then just starting like, hey, we got a bunch of people and let's start a school, would we create public education the way that it is right now? Right? Probably not. We're only dealing with it the way they are because we've always dealt with it that way. But if we could carpet bomb and start over, it'd be a completely different animal.
Well, there's all interesting parallels between industrialism and the public education system, that it being modeled after the factory. The bell rings in the morning, 7 a.m., your shift starts, that it's modeled more after that. And then you get like other kind of ways of reimagining that, like the whole Montessori system of, and that goes back to that word heuristic too, of like kind of like self-exploration and finding your own.
This is like a Sesame Street thing where we can announce the word of the day.
Yeah, that's
right?
the word of the day. Well, it's like we did that before too. It's yeah. That's the word of the day. Yeah, and that's it. so with the whole Montessori system, but how do you do that on a large scale? Because that is one of those things that kind of like, well, number one is small class sizes too. I think that's a big starting point too.
And people learn differently. So having
Mhm.
schools that were wrapped around how people learn rather than industrialize the method of education.
Mhm.
So have a Montessori for people who gravitate towards that learning style.
And that goes back to the whole active transportation trail too. Because honestly, like even though I, I'm kind of into academics and all that, in some ways I kind of learn better being out and understanding. Like we talked before about my experience on the Katy Trail and learning about Lewis and Clark. Like I never really cared too much about Lewis and Clark, but when you're actually on the Missouri River and you understand, and you see like the old maps, understand what this means of I never really thought before about that Spain used to claim that area. Missouri used to be part of Spain. But when you're actually in that area and you see the history and it makes sense geographically, then I learned about that better than I could have learned from a book, and I think a lot of kids, and understanding our Mahoning Valley, if you took, Youngstown City school students and you brought them down to the transportation trail along the river and it talked about our history with the steel industry and whatnot, and you had it all laid out there, I think it would one generate more pride in our community and seeing how cool it is down there. To understand the history of it better, and it would be a different way for kids to learn than just looking at an old textbook.
Yeah, and I really think that if we took, I'm a decentralizer. So if you take sort of like federal control away and you let communities create their own schoolings for what works for their communities, I think you take away that where some communities or urban areas get totally shafted by the resources that get allocated to them
Hmm.
because of how that system works. And I don't think you fix that by like moving assets around. You got to change it from a sort of a mathematical or systemic level.
Hmm. Well, yeah, it's a big question in Youngstown too about the whole state takeover thing under Kasich when the state of Ohio put the CEO in over the school board, and that was a big conflict. And number one, it seems like the school board has been ineffectual in Youngstown for a long time, but I also don't agree with the the governor coming in and taking over unilaterally the school district, and it created a lot of conflict around here too.
Right.
So I don't think either of those two solutions have been working. But also city government has been reticent to get involved. The only thing I've heard actually, the city government actually even taking a stance on anything is this recent uh, internet thing. Did you hear about all that? That
No.
it seemed like I only saw one blip about it, but it seemed like the CEO of the school system was gonna take, I don't know how true this is or not, but was gonna take like a $17 million bid to extend internet, like I guess Wi-Fi for the city of Youngstown. Because one, it is a huge problem, especially in the pandemic really brought up that you have communities that don't have proper access to internet.
Right.
So it seemed like the idea was in the right place, but obviously you should never take a no you want to have multiple bids on
Right.
how much it's going to cost, and that was the main problem of it. But I've also heard all along that the city government doesn't get involved with the school system, but they did in that case, and so I don't know what's
Yeah,
up with
and
that.
I'm cool with them, trying to innovate and trying things that are a little outside the box. I mean, but you've seen cities that, Warren did something similar where they bought a bunch of like wireless infrastructure. This happened a couple times since the 90s even. And, when it doesn't go right or the funding falls short, then community turns their back on out of the box thinking, and then you're stuck then with more traditional. So, in my line of work, like I might have to try something 10 times before I find the formula that actually works.
Mhm.
And somehow I've kept the community on my side through those series of failures because of transparency. I don't BS people. I don't tell them that I'm certain of something. And I think in politics we sort of like oversell what these things are going to do.
Mm.
In the school system, for instance, like I'm a big fan of STEM, and bringing STEM programs into urban areas, I think breathed a little of resources into them,
Mhm.
brought some attention to them, and brought community support to them.
Mhm.
So if it actually pans out and works, then that was a good motive, like adding a new program to get new renewed interest into bringing new technologies and
Mhm.
innovations. It's a great thing.
I agree STEM's important, but you also need the humanities and all that too, and that's what a balanced university should be, and that's what worries me up at YSU is that they're sacrificing the other things, but, they're prioritizing STEM and athletics, but a lot of the other things they're getting rid of. But I
Well, if
think
they
it's
have waning interest, like if they're on the downslope and they need something to like put the paddles on the chest and get the heart beating again, I think that was a Hail Mary more than anything.
well, hopefully the people actually we are actually able to save the programs before they're actually cut though. Um, but yeah, I mean, it definitely revitalized interest, I guess. But I think what's also interesting about the whole STEM thing is I think one of the things that kind of kickstarted in this area was the whole idea of a fracking boom again, and that kind of brought in money. I'm against hydraulic fracturing and that whole process, but I think it did kind of like the ramping up for that for the boom that never actually ended up happening. But at least it kind of kickstarted STEM, so kind of was an ideal scenario that it did bring in um, more funding for STEM, and I think like oh wow got like some grants and stuff around STEM because of it. But luckily, they didn't actually have to end up doing. Although there is still fracking somewhat around here, but it wasn't like the boom that they thought it would be. Oh, there's a downside to that too. That like V&M Star that they kind of ramped up for production for that, but it never materialized. But we also have an water infrastructure problem in this country too. So I've wondered like these fracking tubes that V&M makes, can they be used for water infrastructure
Interesting.
instead? Yeah,
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah. So now they for a year they circulated petitions and asked public to see what you would do with the COVID money spending on infrastructure and whatever. And we have a host of things that we would put on that short list. What would you say?
Oh,
Where would you spend it?
number one before anything is that we have to fix the combined sewage overflow issue into the Mahoning. I mean, that's to me that's issue number one. You can't just dump sewage into the river. It affects our
They're doing
downstream.
that?
Yeah, the
Really?
EPA. Yeah, the EPA. I guess they deferred the fine on the city for it, but the EPA says you got to stop doing this. That we could fine you all this money. I think they deferred the fine, but it's something that needs fixed. I guess the city says they're going to fix it by 2030 something, but to me, it's unacceptable to happen at all in the
Didn't
meantime.
realize that.
Oh yeah, Volney Rogers, the founder of Mill Creek Park, a great hero with that. When the city, way back, this is like 1920 something, but when the city was talking about like, oh, our combined sewage overflow, we're just going to dump it in Mill Creek. He was like, absolutely not. You're not going to just dump sewage into the park. And they're like, no, we're doing it anyways. And he left town. He said, all right, bye then, because of all that. And here we are 100 years later, and it still hasn't been fixed. And it's not just Youngstown, it's Boardman too, because it all comes downstream. So Youngstown needs to fix that before anything else. And then Boardman too, yeah, that shouldn't be happening.
Now that when you said the water lines are they lead lined like other communities are? What's our
Probably. I don't think that's part of the issue right now. I guess the whole lead lining thing is an issue unless the pipes sit empty for a long time.
Okay.
And that's what happened in Flint is that when they switched water sources and they reactivated these old lead line pipes, they had already started deteriorating. And then that's what was, so I think as long as they keep going, it's not as much of an issue. But no, it's just a matter of you have your, sewage treatment plants. And when it rains a lot and stuff, and there's more water coming through and it's more than they could process, they just dump it in the river.
Okay. And I know a lot of our communities like Struthers and Boardman are having some flooding issues in that same department where Army Corps of Engineers have been out a bunch of times to see how, we can stop the property damage in some of these, frequent offending, areas too. Because it's not habitable by, if you're keeping things dry and not having your basement destroyed every couple years.
Yeah. And the flooding's an issue out in Boardman too. Like the Boardman Plaza a couple years ago, like that was all flooded too. But yeah, I mean, that goes back to like, you need to have kind of green planning of like, and especially with climate change and everything, it's going to get worse. The weather is going to get worse. There's going to be more flooding places. So as you're building more and more roads and more developments and, climate change, who knows what's going to happen? You need to plan for those things better. And city planning has gotten better at that. Like when they redid in front of International Tower down here, they created like the green infrastructure gully for water retention and whatnot. And I can't remember who it was, but like a couple years ago, there was someone like that's what they specialized around here, and they were a smart person, but I can't remember offhand who that was. But yeah, you got to plan for that.
All right, cool show, man. This was fun to talk about. We got to do it
as always, Joe. Yeah,
thanks, all right, man. Thanks, man.